Just for a bit of background, first of all, I mean, what got you involved? What got you interested in the prison population?
Well, I grew up in the Bronx in the era of mass incarceration, so it was unavoidable as an issue, as a topic, as a thing that was present. But I started volunteering in prison about 17 years ago through a host of circumstances that led me to be in touch with people who are in prison and be invited to be an educational volunteer. And that led to my starting the Prison to College Pipeline program at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where I teach. And that led to global work and the book Incarceration Nations, and then the Incarceration Nations Network.
So you've effectively travelled around the world looking at prisons.
Yes.
And, give us an overview of, what's the kind of the stark differences between the way in which different countries do things?
Well, actually, what's more remarkable is the stark similarities and the embarrassingly stark similarities, because the idea of the modern prison, i.e. the idea of using prison as the exclusive response to crime and as the exclusive instrument of justice, is an American invention that was foisted upon the world. And so the most striking thing that I've seen is the way that we have cut and pasted this very bereft model of justice all over the world, in scenarios where it doesn't work, where it doesn't build safer communities, where it is an outdated mode of building justice, not unlike the guillotine. It's, of course, a harsh and a cruel and unusual mode of punishment. And as far as I'm concerned, it was a radical experiment that's had its time.
Well, okay, so there's a thought that the best way to tackle crime is to bang criminals up for as long as possible.
Well, that depends what your objective is. If your objective is to punish people and to harm people and to say you've committed harm, so I'm going to harm you back and we're going to further a cycle of harm, then yes, prisons are very effective at doing that. If your objective is actually to build safer communities and to say, how do I stop this cycle of harm, and how do I give the people who've been harmed what they're due and what they're owed by a justice system, then prisons are not the approach.
Financially, there's obviously a cost to putting people in prison. I think in the UK something like 3 billion a year, but the reoffending cost is much higher. But then you could argue, well, then just keep those people in prison for longer and you won't have that cost, if you know what I mean.
Well, you will have the cost of incarcerating them further. And not only that, you will have the cost of further crime and harm in the community. Because if it's not them committing the crime, it's the people, the ripple effect of the people that they are connected to. When you incarcerate one person, you incarcerate a family, you incarcerate entire communities. You create, again, this cycle of harm and the cycle of impact that doesn't ultimately make us safer. We are wasting, and I say we as a world, of course the US doing this in very dramatic ways, but this is true all over the world, we are wasting billions of dollars on a system that has expired. And if we're going to spend this money, and I should say, in fact, that in almost every country, prisons and corrections tend to fall at the bottom of the budget still, but we're still talking about large sums of money. Why aren't we spending the money to innovate? Why aren't we spending the money to say, how do we find innovative solutions? How do we invest money in communities instead of investing money in prisons, which are clearly not working? I always say that if any company were run on the kinds of numbers that prisons run on, globally speaking, with maybe one or two exceptions, i.e. The Nordic countries and maybe Singapore, then we would shut that company down immediately. And yet, due to a host of circumstances, systemic inequalities, systemic racism, and frankly, laziness, we persist in this mode of addressing crime that is dated, that is harmful, and that is not giving us the kind of results that we as a community deserve.
So, having travelled around, and you say it's a global issue that that a lot of countries are resorting to, apart from perhaps the Nordic countries, as you say. How does Britain compare with other places you've been to?
Well, Britain is, I think of Britain and Australia in the same context as being very fast on the path of copycatting the US in profound ways. And so what you're seeing here is over-incarceration of particular groups, Black and Middle Eastern people in the same way that the U.S. is over-incarcerating African Americans and Latinos. There's an increasing talk of tough on crime, instead of something like smart on crime, which is a far more effective approach to addressing harm. We're seeing a lot of public hysteria around things like knife crime, and I'm not, again, minimizing the harms of violence, but when we start talking in this hysterical way, and I've seen this in Australia with the Murdoch press as well, and it's very familiar to me because this is and was the U.S. This is what led us to mass incarceration, this harsh war on drugs and treating drugs as a criminal justice issue instead of as a public health issue. It's all very familiar to me, and I think the UK and Australia are doing it in the most intensified fashion and thinking of America as this model. America is the one to follow in terms of creating more prisons and addressing increase in crime with more prisons. And one of my primary messages in the world is always, don't copycat us. Yes, we have some innovations that are worth copycatting, but overall, the U.S. system is what got the world into this mess to begin with. It's not worth copycatting.
There has been a lot of press about knife crime, and it has gone up. Knife crime's gone up. And one of the responses has been, we're going to increase the penalty for carrying a knife. You know, you could get incarcerated for that. That's a deterrent. We're using that as a deterrent to stop young people carrying knives. What's wrong with that?
So this whole deterrent thing is a ludicrous approach to crime. We already know, and studies have shown, that prison as deterrence and harsh punishment as deterrence does not work. It just doesn't jive with the way that people who are engaged in criminal acts psychologically operate. They're not going to suddenly in the middle of this act think, oh gee, I better put this knife away, otherwise I'll go to prison. And that's not my opinion. Those are studies that have proven this. And so when we're talking about responding to things like knife crime with stop and frisk, or as you call it here, stop and search, and more prisons and harsher punishment, I would say, yes, let's look at the U.S. Let's look at America and look at the way that this did not work. The former mayor of New York City, Mayor Bloomberg, just apologized for stop and frisk. And it's still a topic of conversation as something that's going to build safer communities. You destroy communities that way. You do not deter people from committing crime. You do not create smart, effective policing that is engaged with the community, that makes people actually trust the police and engage with them and say, we're going to build safer communities with you. We in the US are an example of the roads not to take.
I just want to come back to your kind of like impression of British prisons. We talked about the justice system, but you've been into some British prisons. What do you make of the standard, if you like, of the prisons that you've been to in the UK?
Well, I think the prisons in the UK are similar to everywhere else that I've been, in that often there isn't a standard. There can be a wide variety of kinds of prisons and approaches. And this is true in the US from state to state, from city to city. It really can vary dramatically. So I've been in Pentonville prison here, which I compare to Rikers Island in New York or Pollsmoor prison in South Africa, two places that I've spent a lot of time, in that it's a living hell. And there is no one on earth who could walk into Pentonville and imagine that place is making people better, is engaged in the act of corrections. And so
what struck you about it?
It's chaos. It's people crammed into cells with little access to services, people with serious mental health issues and often substance abuse issues, people from deprived communities, systemic inequality and systemic racism who are not getting services, who are getting now some access to, a little bit of access to some educational services, but not nearly enough, not giving them opportunities, and instead exposing them to more madness and to further criminality. It's very much, again, akin to Rikers Island, which is being shut down in New York. Nobody said that was possible, but there's finally a widespread recognition that this place, which is like hell, is not going to engage in the act of corrections. But I should say that on the other hand, I've also been in HMP Grendon, which is a therapeutic prison, and Spring Hill as well. And that is run more like an open prison, similar again to the Nordic models, where there's lots of progressive stuff happening and a staff that is quite engaged in the act of corrections. So It varies dramatically, but I think that's testament to what a mess the system is. They can't even, and this is again not just the UK, but in general, you can't even systematize how do we do this right, and how do we not have it just be sort of a lottery as far as what prison you happen to end up in and whether it's actually engaged in the act of corrections, which it allegedly is enacting.
Do you think Pentonville should be shut down?
Absolutely, Pentonville should be shut down. But I say that about many institutions, again, including Pollsmoor Prison in South Africa, which is the largest prison in Africa and is also akin to Rikers Island. Prisons as a whole, generally speaking, are not the response. They don't build safer communities. So I'm in favor of shutting many, many prisons down and figuring out how to invest that money in communities, how to invest that money in public health and taking that approach. Again, the UK, Scotland has been a renowned model for that approach in a host of different realms. So I argue for the shutting down of many, many of these so-called correctional facilities.
I mean, one thing that, well, I think in this report it said, that mass incarceration has coincided with a fall in crime. So would you say that, here we go, the rapid rise in prison population largely coincided with a sharp fall in crime levels from their peak in the mid-1990s. I mean, some people say, well, we should just keep locking people up. And if you actually shut down prisons, crime's going to go back up.
So that's
again.
a highly complex matter. But correspondence does not mean correlation. Correlation does not mean causation.
Right.
So yes, we know that, and this is again the great conversation. I'm from New York City, and it's a tremendous conversation. What caused the crime drop in New York City? And it's generally widely accepted that it was not due to mass incarceration. There are many, many studies that show you that, in fact, there were numerous other causes that reduced crime, including, the truth is, a lot of it is not rocket science. Greater social services means less crime. More equality means less crime. You don't need a PhD to determine that and to argue for that. And so when we look again at the Nordic model, which is touted as this wonderful one, I always say yes, they have these open prisons there and there's a lot of progressive things happening, but on a basic level, what the Nordic countries can boast about that my country cannot boast about is something very simple: social services. And so I don't think we need to do more of these studies on what produced the crime drop necessarily. A lot of it is pretty basic.
Let's look at that in a bit more detail. So if the answer isn't lock them up, what should we be looking at? What should we be thinking we need to do to reduce crime? What if you had to sort of lay out, your plan, as it were, what would it be?
So I'll preface this with, I don't have the big answer. There is no the big answer, and I don't think any one person has it. But the work that I do with the Incarceration Nations Network is try to elevate many different possible answers and innovative approaches that are looking past prisons, that are both sort of cleaning up the mess of prisons in the here and now in terms of offering reintegration services so that people who go to prison can actually come back into the world and be integrated into a world that frankly, they were probably never integrated in the first place, again, due to systemic racism and systemic poverty, offering educational access to people in prisons and coming out of prisons, and other kinds of what I see as just cleaning up the mess that we've made by relying on these institutions. But there are also all kinds of big picture systemic approaches. One of the big ones, of course, is restorative justice, is thinking about how do we respond to harm, not with further harm, but with an opportunity for the people who've been harmed and the people who've caused the harm to engage with one another and create a system of reparations. And so the work of INN is to elevate those who are doing this work. I'm, of course, also very interested in models of, I hate to use the word facilities, but for lack of a better term, facilities or institutions that truly engage in the act of corrections, like some of the open prison models, where people can come and go to school on the outside and work on the outside and then get the therapy and the treatment and the assistance and the guidance and the trauma, the addressing of trauma that they deserve. Lots of initiatives in the US now are being led by people who are directly impacted. That's one of the few things I'm proud of in terms of the US movement right now, is that the people who have experienced the problem who have experienced incarceration are coming forth with ideas about solutions. Another term that's being thrown around quite a bit in the U.S. is justice reinvestment, and not just in the U.S., actually, in other countries. Australia, there's a very strong conversation about this too. How do we think about taking the money that we're using in prisons and putting them in communities and addressing legacies of systemic racism and systemic poverty? And so there's this broad term known as alternatives to incarceration. It's a term I dislike because that implies that incarceration is the main event and the alternatives are the little experiments, when in fact everything should be an alternative to incarceration. We should be thinking about how do we mediate situations before they even reach the criminal justice system? How do we create avenues for people who've committed acts of harm to make amends and make reparations in ways that are healing to the person who've been harmed and also the person who's done the harming? How do we divert people, not just young people, but all people out of a system and in ways that build safer communities?
What about mental health? Because a lot of people in prison suffer from mental health problems. Is there something that can be done in prison, or should more be done in prison to address that issue?
Well, mental health issues are a massive issue, but again, you're not going to do that, and you're not going to be able to address them in a traditional prison as it stands now, while you're traumatizing people, addressing their trauma. So you have to build an altogether other institution. And this is true, of course, with substance abuse as well. The war on drugs is one of the greatest global failures in history. It's ludicrous to think that you can fight drugs the way with a military tank, the way you fight wars. And so one of the areas of research, and not even research because I'm not researching it, the research has been done, but rather elevating some of the countries and the programs that are trying to tackle drugs as a public health issue. Portugal is a very prominent example in this regard, but other kinds of, we're seeing a shift in marijuana policies and thinking about how do we address substance abuse, and substance abuse and mental health are often closely related, because why do people turn to substances? Because they're struggling with various things. So the elephant in the room is trauma. How do we address the traumas, not just in the here and now, but all over the world? What you find are overrepresented groups in the criminal justice system. So we can talk about Black and Middle Eastern folks here in the UK. We can talk about African Americans and Latinos in the US. We can talk about Aboriginal people and Indigenous people in New Zealand, in Australia, in Canada. We could talk about poor people throughout the global South who are legacies of colonialism and post-colonialism and classism. So every country has its sort of targeted group. How do we address that systemic and historic legacy of trauma that has essentially funneled people directly from their communities into prison cells?
It's really interesting because we have we definitely have a growing youth mental health problem in the UK, and one of the things that you can identify is sort of growing sense of hypervigilance, post-traumatic stress disorder amongst young people. And that appears to be growing. I mean, in a sense that you've got young people in the UK who are showing symptoms that are similar to perhaps, I don't know, what you might consider a child soldier in Africa would have. Why do you think, you've looked at this on a global scale, I mean, do you think that that's happening more in developed countries like the UK, that we've got this sort of this growing sense of traumatized people who are ending up in the prison system?
The world is full of populations of traumatized people because they have been targeted for years and years by their own societies as being others. And they have been criminalized, they have been mass incarcerated, they have been over-policed. That is the legacy of the world that we have created. In the US, there are studies now looking at comparing veterans returning from war to people coming home from prison. It's the same kinds of trauma because these are people who have been victims of a war on whether it's blackness or indigenousness or poverty. these are, so of course they're going to exhibit the same traumas. And of course that trauma is going to be passed on from generation to generation, not only because we know that intergenerational trauma is real, but also because we persist in responding to the kind of traits of this trauma or the manifestations of this trauma with further harm. So over-policing communities, creating further trauma where a child who is 9 years old is being stopped and searched and stopped and frisked in New York. It's a cycle of harm that again is not saying we need to address the legacy of trauma in the past and the history of trauma in the past, and also the ways that we are perpetuating this through racism, through over-policing, through mass incarceration, and through criminalizing otherness.
But if someone commits a crime, even though they may have all this trauma and mental health problems, you can't, there's an argument, you simply can't treat a criminal like a victim.
I would actually disagree with that, because the reality is that most quote-unquote criminals are also quote-unquote victims. And this binary, and again, I'm speaking globally here, this binary that we've created is imaginary. If you look at the people in prison, the good bulk of them, and studies have shown this, have been victimized. The people in prison, the people who are being harmed, when you look at the knife crime phenomenon here in the UK, it's the same people engaging with each other. That's what I mean by cycles of harm. And so that's not to say that when someone commits an act of harm, we should not take that seriously, we should not address it, we should not figure out how to make sure that that never happens again. But we also need to recognize that in all likelihood, that person who is the criminal is also the victim. And that's also why prisons don't work. It's a way of just taking this out of the community and thinking about community justice and saying, let's just warehouse people away and then somehow that'll make the problem go away. When in fact we need to say, community fabrics are being torn apart. How do we engage in acts of restoration? How do we think about restorative justice? How do we think about offering someone school as an option instead of prison? And that is what's called smart on crime instead of tough on crime. But one of the primary binaries that I'm always emphasizing is that we need to stop thinking about the victim and the offender because they're the same person.
Even if everything you've said has won everybody over, isn't your biggest problem that this is expensive? It costs money to actually help people in the way that you would like to help people, to have, rehabilitation programs, to stop people falling into crime in the first place. It all costs money, doesn't it?
So, two answers to that. One is that prisons are already expensive. We're already wasting money. Do we want to do this in a smart way, or do we want to just continue to waste taxpayers' money in ways that's not building safer communities? The second thing I would say is, you know what? Justice is expensive. And I don't just mean that in the literal sense. I mean, justice matters. It is the foundation of our society. It is the foundation of an economy. It's the foundation of everything. You don't have a safe community, you don't have anything else. And so if you care about everything else, which people do, we live in a capitalist society, everybody cares about their wallets. If you care about your wallet, you should care about justice. It's the foundation on which everything else rests. I often think about Silicon Valley in the US and the amount of essentially monopoly money that people are able to spend experimenting with the newest app and the newest device and throwing away money often on experiments that don't work. But they do it for apps. If we're willing to do it for that, are we not willing to do it for justice, which is, again, the foundation on which everything else rests? We need to innovate, we need to experiment, we need to give things a chance, we need to invest in things, both literally and metaphorically. We need to start talking to the public in a different way about what justice means and getting them to think beyond this silly tough on crime and war on drugs and war on knife crime approach that isn't building safer communities. And we need to engage all of those things together in order to build the community that collectively I think all of us want.
And that touches on what your other problem is that the public don't care. And we're in an election, or let's say we've just come through an election by the time this interview goes out, we've just come through an election and prisons weren't mentioned. Who's winning over the public with a policy on prisons? Nobody cares.
Well, the thing is that people do care. They care about crime. They're hyped up about crime.
They don't care about criminals. They don't actually care about what happens to someone once they go into a prison, unless it's a member of their family.
Because they've been duped to think that prisons are making them safer. People do care about safety. They are talking about safety. They're talking about, knife crime here. They're talking about gun violence in the U.S. People want safety, and people do care, but they have been duped for centuries into thinking that this bereft system of mass incarceration is making them safer. And so therefore they just automatically, axiomatically think criminal prison. That's the whole point of the kind of work that I and all the people in the INN network are trying to do, which is let's be smart about this. You have to care, and you have to think about this differently. And I remain optimistic on this because I've seen a shift in the U.S. Prisons, when I first started volunteering in prisons almost 20 years ago, no one wanted to hear it. Everyone thought I was crazy, and not just me. Lots of people who were engaged in the kind of work that I was doing. And it was impossible to get funding for work when you were doing prison work. And that started to shift. And it started to shift so dramatically that now it's one of the most in issues in the US. Because of the shift in discourse, because of films like 13th and books like The New Jim Crow and other kinds of things that suddenly pushed this to the public eye in ways where the average citizen looked up and said, hey, we're being duped here. We need to think about this. So if people don't care, it's because they've been made not to care, and that can change.
Okay, I don't think people do care in this country. I think that is still an issue. How do you...
Can I ask you, though, which people do you mean? Because
there's
lots of people in directly impacted communities who do care.
My thought is, so for example, a producer I worked with who said they made a piece of TV about people coming out of prison, and it went out and it was one of the least watched programs. Because, people are kind of interested in crime and will watch crime dramas and will watch stuff about knife crime and will get scared about what's going on in the streets. But actually prisoners, once they go into prison, and stories about people being rehabilitated, it doesn't capture the public imagination in the UK, I don't think.
Well, so
how do you do that?
I would answer that twofold. I mean, when we talk, I don't know about public imagination. I know that there's a lot of public imaginations. So it depends which community we're talking about. Because again, directly impacted communities, i.e. Black communities, care. And they want to hear about this. It's just that often the media is not, and I hate to lump everything into one, but often media does not care about catering to that population. When I first started pitching my book years ago in the US, I heard nobody wants to read about prison. No one wants to read about prison. And can't you write about something else? And of course I didn't, but now it's a whole industry in the US. Why? Because number one, we have these assumptions that are not correct. Maybe a badly done program is not going to draw people in, but people do care if you make them care. If you approach this issue with nuance and sensitivity and you make them realize it's our duty. I mean, I work as a writer, I've worked as a journalist, and so it's our duty to make people care about things that matter. So saying this doesn't cater to the public, well, that's a cop-out.
What happens if we don't? Where's the British prison system heading if we don't deal with this? If we don't change the way in which we're currently doing things?
Well, I would say the British system would head rapidly down the American path, where you're locking masses of people up. We have 2.3 million incarcerated, millions and estimated 70 million people with criminal histories. We have the numbers are ridiculous, and our recidivism rates hover, or as you call them, reoffending rates, hover in the 60%. We have a gun violence epidemic. We have lots of innovative efforts trying to address that, but we're not actively building safer communities. We are wasting money. There were states that were under constitutional mandate in the US to reduce their prison population because they could not afford basic health care for their people in prison because they were locking so many people up. Is that a path that this country wants to go down? I don't think so. I mean, people are rightly upset about incidents of knife crime here. Well, how do you feel about gun violence and mass shootings, which we're addressing?
And do you think we're heading that way? From what you've seen of our prisons, I mean, what sort of what gives you that sense?
I think the world, unfortunately, is heading in the American direction because of this legacy, and that's with some exceptions, but because of this legacy of copycatting a bereft model that is not building safer communities. So I don't see the UK as being necessarily unique in this. I see this as a global trend, and the work that I, with INN and our network partners are trying to do is to stop that trend and to say, let's sit up and let's look at other approaches, globally speaking, as a world, as a global community, that do move us in another direction and don't rely on this archaic notion that has been foisted upon the world and doesn't make sense anymore and never did make sense.
Thank you very much.
Jason, there's one thing I'd love to. That's really amazing. Thank you. It's so interesting to hear. Yeah. But the one thing I really took away from your book was, because restorative justice. I mean, there's always people who are going to say, you know what, my child was raped. You know, the really awful types of stuff where people just think, you know what, I don't care. I want to lock that person up and I want them to burn in hell. I wonder if you might talk about Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide and restorative justice and how you saw that unfold there with truly the worst things that have ever kind of happened in our living memory.
Sure.
Yeah, go on.
So restorative justice. I think restorative justice, unfortunately, people think of it, it has a bad rap in the public eye, even if people even know what it is at all. I mean, generally speaking, restorative justice is not nearly as well known as it should be. But people think of it as this kind of soft, let's hold hands and make friends and then pretend that, you know, we can make crime go away that way approach to crime, when in fact it's anything but. So that one of the chapters on restorative justice in my book was about the Rwandan genocide, and I spent time in that country with young people who had lost parents in the genocide, building with them, visiting prisons with them, because they wanted to confront not necessarily people who had directly killed their parents, but the people who represented that act of harm. And through them, I came to understand lots of things and also read many studies about the needs of people who have been harmed. And these are not studies that I've done. These are studies that are out there, that are from the US, that are from New Zealand, that come to us from around the world. And what these studies show us again and again and again is that the things that are being promoted to people who have been harmed are not actually the things that are going to bring them the healing that they deserve. We sell people on revenge. We sell people on an eye for an eye, the idea that you've been harmed, so harming someone else is gonna bring you the healing that you deserved. But in fact, many studies have shown the opposite, that in fact what people need is restitution, they need healing, they need to be heard and listened to, they need to be certain that this will never happen again to someone else. And those are not things that the prison system, mass incarceration, promotes. In fact, quite the opposite. Mass incarceration produces all of those things. Further harm, lack of ability to meet one's economic needs. One of the radical restorative justice programs, and I use radical in the sense that radical's from the word the root, and so it's grounded in reality. It's not out there. It's a real thing. It's called Common Justice. It operates in New York, and it addresses violent crime through restorative justice with enormous success. So what restorative justice is doing, as we've seen it enacted all over the world, is say, how do we rethink the axiomatic assumptions about the needs of people who've been harmed? And again, recognize that the people who've been harmed and the people who've done the harming are in a deep symbiotic relationship, as they were in Rwanda. They were the same people. Divided by ethnic affiliation, but part of the same communities and therefore deeply intertwined.
And that coming together of the victim and the perpetrator, if you like, I mean, and you witnessed that. What sort of things came out of that? Did you?
Well, I mean, in my time in Rwanda visiting prisons with young genocide survivors, I witnessed what, for these young people for whom these people in the prisons had been these othered monsters for so many years of their life, at least the 2 decades of their life, to engage with them on a one-on-one level as human beings. What they told me after those visits was how much it liberated them from the hate, the anger, the bitterness, And that's not to say that overnight they suddenly forgave them and it was all one big happy family. It's never that simple, and it never will be that simple. But it was a profound insight to what the real needs of people who have been harmed are and how we need to really radically rethink them and address them.
Would that work, do you think, for, I don't know, a rape victim or, the family of a murder victim to meet the person who actually did that and to go through that? Do you think that's something you would advocate?
I would advocate, and again, I advocate this based on the studies of the programs, including the one I mentioned, Common Justice. Common Justice has found that restorative justice is most successful in cases of the most serious crimes. It often tends to get used in the cases of the minor crimes. Is it always successful? Is it foolproof? Of course not. No justice system will ever be foolproof. We have to accept that. But the enormity of this approach, which goes back centuries. It's not some newfangled, modern, new age thing. Restorative justice has been used, it's used as the basis of the New Zealand youth justice system, which I actually personally visited, because of indigenous approaches to justice. It was used in Rwanda not because it was some newfangled thing, but again, because this was what the justice system looked like before colonialism imposed this system of incarceration as justice on Rwanda. The original justice in that part of the world was a restorative approach. There are going to be problems with any system, and there are going to be failures with any system. But overall, we don't need to build to the exception. To the exception, we need to build to the rule.
But would you say that in the UK, victims of serious crimes should have that opportunity to go into prisons and meet the perpetrator?
Well, I would say that in the UK, as globally, people who have been victims of crime should not have to go into prisons to do that, but that restorative justice can replace prisons as a system of justice. Yeah. Not overnight, not in some just snap your fingers and it's easy sort of a way, but slowly and systemically as we work this system through, yes, and then they can truly get the kind of healing that they deserve. I mean, I have been all over the world and I've met, of course, genocide survivors in Rwanda, but even more than that, I've met people who have survived enormous acts of harm or who have lost people to violence in really dramatic ways. And the first question I always ask them when there's a space to engage and when they're open to it is, what are your needs? Or what would justice look like to you? I have met people. I met someone in the Congo who was a victim, whose mother was a victim of severe sexual violence, and I asked him, "Do you want those men to go to prison?" Because they were never caught, and he said, "No, I want to sit down with them. I want to engage with them." I met a woman whose brother was murdered in North Carolina, and everyone knew who did this, who committed this act, and that person was never caught. And she and I spent a lot of time talking, and I said, "Do you want that man to go to prison?" And she said, "No, why do I want to send another black man to prison to come back and further harm the community and then have a ripple effect that impacts me and my son? I do know," she said, "that my nephew needs a father figure and needs some support and needs financial support and assistance. And I would love for that individual to maybe step in that regard and engage with me in that regard." It's not as uncommon and as out there as we might think.
So just to take an example, say there was a gang of, this is happening more and more, a gang of kids stab another child to death on the streets of London or whatever. In your view, should those 5 children who were involved in that stabbing go to prison?
I don't think, it depends again what our objectives are. If we want to build a safer community, so if we send them to prison, they're going to get further damaged in that process. Most likely the people who've been harmed in this instance, the mothers, the fathers, the communities, might feel some sense of satisfaction, of the instant satisfaction of revenge that those kids have gone off to prison. But then what? That passes, their loss is still their loss. You have people now being further traumatized who are going to come out of that situation, and your sentences are much shorter than ours, so people are coming out having been further damaged, more likely to commit those crimes again. I mean, it's a basic illogic.
So the alternative would be what, to send them to a college, educate them?
There are many alternatives. One is, of course, engage in the act of prevention and investing in communities so that act wouldn't happen in the first place.
Presuming it had.
But presuming it had, there are ways to take these individuals and put them in acts that are actually in institutions that are engaging in the act of corrections, however that looks, and give them an opportunity to give back and serve restitution to the people that they've harmed. There's all kinds of paradigms that we can play with. And again, I don't sit here saying, number one, I have the right to deem, what's appropriate for these people. I'm here to just promote, can we start thinking outside the box here, which is not so far outside the box. Again, it has a long legacy in the world. And how do we not just have this axiomatic, do the crime, do the time formula?
But it wouldn't seem crazy to you not to lock up, someone who's committed a murder, and to maybe say, okay, no, let's put them into a different scenario where they can actually kind of reform and reintegrate into society quite quickly.
I can say that I have seen in various parts of the world scenarios where that has occurred to great success in ways that gave the person who was harmed what they deserved and in ways that actually moved the needle towards safer communities. I can say that I have witnessed that, and that organizations out there in the world are engaged in just that.
Yeah.
Great.
Amazing.
No worries.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just don't present it as, she says everybody who commits murder should go free and all that. I know how this can get twisted. So I'm trusting you all to not have it.
We're not interested in doing that. We're not a red
Okay.
top. We're not a red top.
Yeah.
Put that in Jason's
I trust you all.